This is my mom. She's having canepas. How would you say canepas in Cuba?
Mamoncillos.
Mamoncillos. It's a very fleshy fruit. Anyways, my mom still lives back in the island, and I learned a lot about our Taino identity through her because she works well with the land, herbs, spirituality, those kind of things. But it was my grandmother who took me aside, and I was, I don't know, maybe 10 years old. She took me aside in the back of the mango tree, and she said, I have a secret to tell you. One thing, she goes, I won't be here for a long time, but I want you to know that you're Indian. You're a Taino. Don't you ever forget that. And I was thinking, gosh, she's going to cook really well. My favorite meal. Like, yeah, Grandma, yeah, Grandma. So I didn't really pay much attention to it. It was, you just are, you know. But years later, this thing was gnawing on me. Well, what's this Taino? What's this indigenous identity? What does it mean? So I looked at our history books. And our history books basically began, flip it, please. When Christopher Columbus arrived, 1492, is when we're taught history began. But there's, as you all know, there's much more history beforehand. So that's what I wanted to explore. And what I wanted to explore was, what are all these crazy people calling themselves Tainos when we were told that, you know, we're a mixed African and Spaniard, and that the Taino is just a symbol. Well, people are arguing, well, we've always been Tainos. When the colonizers arrived and when the black slaves were introduced, they had to become part of the indigenous life only because if you wanted to survive on those islands, you had to learn the culture, the habits and such. So I thought I was the only crazy one, so I created a website, and I said, hey, is anybody out there Tainos? This movement has been around for about 30 years very strongly, mainly in New York vicinity. So, go to the next one. So I went to New York, and that's me filming up there. This is, I don't know, 2010, I believe. And this is celebrating Christopher Columbus Day. About a block or half a block away is the Columbus Drive with the big statue of him up there. And if you notice, what was unique about this is there were other indigenous folks from many Latin American countries, from South America, Mexico. If you think about it, Turtle Island is all of the Americas. So there's sort of a reawakening or a self-awareness about this idea about indigenous identity. Next slide. This is one of my main characters. They say in storytelling, it's easy to follow a story if you follow a character. So this gentleman, this is at the United Nations. If you can, this is our previous UN official. What's his name? I can't remember.
Ban Ki-moon?
Yes. So the United Nations recognizes Taino identity. And my friend Roberto, he's on a task force to create a universal language about what indigenous identity is, the standards and such, basically giving people the rights for self-identity. Here I'm presenting at the United Nations. I was invited to present early on my film in front of other indigenous communities. Next. I've gone to the mountains, mountain areas of Puerto Rico. There's communities out there, tobacco growers and such. Only they call themselves Jibaros, or in Cuba and Dominican Republic, they're
Guajiros.
Guajiros. So they understand that they have this rural identity, you know. so a lot of practices are very indigenous in its ways. Next. One of the languages left behind is in the sense of petroglyphs. So you'll see in my research, I've gone to many areas searching for these petroglyphs and trying to understand our story and try to tell our story. The Smithsonian Institute found out about my project, and they said, hey, what if? So they invited me along with prominent archaeologists, geneticists, all these scholars to a round table and discuss, why don't we look at this idea of indigenous identity? It's actually in the Native American Museum. The Smithsonian already had written articles about that, hey, you know what? That idea of, that 90% of the population back in 1492 was wiped out, that there are no signs of an indigenous identity. Well, the Smithsonian disagreed. They've already been done research, and they wanted to use some of my work in this presentation. Next. It's headed by Roberto Barreiro, Cuban, a prominent scholar, Harvard, taught in Harvard and such. So he headed this project. Next. And here are all the scholars, archaeologists, a Taino chief, a Cuban historian, another Cuban historian, and they really looked at this whole idea of, well, what makes you Native? Cultural identity, is it perpetuated? People say, well, you've heard of the one drop rule, how much do you have to be an Indian? So those are all self-imposed laws and rules. And we're kind of reshaping our story. Next. That's an artifact taken from Cuba. And there's a lot of, the Smithsonian is doing a great job of repatriation, returning a lot of these artifacts back because they are essential to those communities. There are spiritual elements. Next. And a lot of people are still practice today, this is a matter of time, today, they're practicing what they would call Indian ways.
Was that gourds?
Those were words, correct. There's this identity about spirituality. In some shape or form, they're using the old ways, some of the methods. There's things like the semi, which would be used to, they would bury it in their crop. When they wanted to raise a crop, they would bury this semi, basically like a guide, if you will, and to bring good tidings to our agriculture. Next. But it's very matrilineal. So the women are actually the force of perpetuating our story. DNA studies are showing that it's through the women who, by force, during the colonization, that there's a strong DNA study where throughout the population is really strong in Cuba specifically of this DNA indigenous identity. There is a great pride in Puerto Rico where if you go through any towns or cities or stores, they'll have indigenous petroglyph pictures, or maybe the local grocery store, they name it after a great Taino warrior. They're very proud of their Taino heritage as long as it's kept in the past. To see somebody like that is like, who's that crazy guy running down the road? So there's still that stigma. This is an area, it was a fellow photographer, La Piedra Sagrada, where there's a petroglyphs and such next. That's the coqui. Coqui is an indigenous frog to our island, very small. I actually have them here, you know. And right now, the idea of language, they're reconstructing the language based on already existing. A lot of the language form is still there. Next. There's a lot of representation. I thought, well, okay, New York, Puerto Rico, all the islands, but they're all over the world. Hawaii there was a big, there was a time when the state of Hawaii needed workers for the sugar cane. So there was a big migration of people from Puerto Rico that went and lived in the Hawaiian Islands and brought that culture as well. A lot of them brought their Taino knowledge with them. Next. Again, this is Roberto. He's been my main character. When I first started with him, he had a baby in the high chair, and now she's about this tall. That's how long the video's been taking to make. Next. So the question, so what does it mean today? What happened back in 1492 is the kind of elements that this documentary touches on: racism, identity, cultural clash even within the respective communities in Cuba, Dominican Republic. Next. But basically, what these folks are saying is, we are alive and well, and we're going to tell our story. So I'm one of the storytellers. And basically, that's it. And one thing that I want to share is, in every indigenous society, there's the creation story. So right now, that's one of the final elements I'm working on, is that creation story in an animation form. So it'll segue in between all these chapters of storytelling. What I made sure that I had voices on both sides. So I had scholars on both sides, and so within the documentary, you're going to hear other Cuban scholars saying, this notion of Taínos, they're just crazy people. And then you have the Smithsonian saying, well, this is what we're saying, this is what's being proven today. So at the end, I don't think that any indigenous tribe in the world, they really don't care if you don't, they don't care if you care. That nobody cares whether about your opinion. If you don't think I'm Indian, that's your problem. For instance, Trump said in one of his famous speeches, he goes, well, they don't look Indian to me. So those are the kind of things that we're challenged with today. And it's not just our tribes, it's universal, it's happening everywhere. So I'm hoping that this documentary will just start the conversation. There's going to be, in the fall of 2017, a lot of my photography, some video clips, is going to be exhibited at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C.
I got a question for your brother. I'm not asking you to tell it now, but you know your creation story, the location.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, we have the thing, but if you know about creation stories, whenever you sit with an elder, you need a lot of campfires before you tell the story, because it's long. There's just so many stories within our creation story. So I asked, well, I know we have hundreds of years of story just within our creation story. How about if can we condense it down to 10 minutes? And they're oh, brother, you're asking for a lot. And I go, well, the whole idea is just to I call it edutainment. You got to, how do I keep you hooked? How do I keep you interested? And most important, the commonalities that we have, because what happened back then in 1492 is happening today. It's happening today, folks. The immigration laws that are happening, it's affecting us today, and it's going to affect you directly. So that's the big conversation. It's like, what happens to one happens to many. Thank you.